In general, the representation of autism in the media is very narrowed by the presence of various stereotypes that do not portray an actual spectrum of autism. There are many issues to discuss in the conversation of autism portrayal in the media, like the savant trope, infantilization, dehumanizing narratives, and more. There are also positives, and I want to address both of these today in this video. What I want to talk about is Ranpo edogawa from Bungo Stray Dogs and his autistic coding. He is widely considered to have many neurodivergent traits, and more specifically, I believe that he is very much an autistic coded character through his specific autistic traits, through the Untold Origins light novel, and through what his ability represents as a metaphor for autistic masking. I think it's intentional and unintentional coding at the same time. While he is an example of the savant trope, Bungo Stray Dogs has a very humanizing narrative of disabled characters overall that captures the social and affirmation model of disability the most. I think that makes him one of the best executions of an autistic savant that does not sensationalize or outcast him for his disability. What I mean when I say autistic coding is the presence of autistic traits, however, a diagnosis is never explicitly stated in canon or by any of the characters. Ranpo has many autistic traits from specific DSM criteria for an autism spectrum diagnosis, but also, like I said, through the story of Untold Origins, which is his backstory light novel with Fukuzawa, and I also believe that a lot of his interactions with Fukuzawa are related to him being an autistic child in that novel. I believe when you don't read Ranpo as autistic, or in the very least as a disabled character, that you are missing a very major part of his character and of his story that adds a different layer of characterization to him. I do not believe that characters have to be explicitly stated as something to be read as disabled, or in this case, autistic, because implications can be considered canon. And with how much is observable with Ranpo, it leads me to believe that he was at least intentionally coded as disabled and neurodivergent, possibly even intentionally autistic coded. There's two specific categories that the DSM has for autism diagnosis, and that is social and communication difficulties, deficits, differences, whatever you want to call it, and repetitive behaviors / restricted interests. Right, starting off with covering deficits in social and communication areas, there is a typical emotional reciprocity, which is think fear of mind, the double empathy problem, think difficulties with empathy, either hyperempathy or low empathy. For many autistics, they could be at either end of that spectrum. We can also kind of cover back and forth interactions, say conversations, or again, general social emotional interaction. Atypical nonverbal communication is also included in this specific section, but I don't believe Ranpo shows that. However, I'm mentioning it because it's in the DSM. And then for the third criterion in this subsection, there's difficulties developing and maintaining relationships. For the section on repetitive behaviors and restrictive interests, there is repetitive behaviors, also termed stimming, which is what I'll most likely be referring to it as I go on further. And that can be, think something like hand flapping, think more harmful ones like self-harm, think hitting, banging your head against things, sensory behaviors. Most of the time it's a self-soothing thing, which is what stimming is. However, I don't believe it always has to be, but that's what it is in the DSM. There is also an intense fixation on ritual and aversion to change listed under this category, as well as intense fixations and restricted interests, also called special interests, and hyperfixations too, but those are a lot more associated with ADHD than autism. But I think hyperfixation are associated with both. Special interests are an autism specific thing though, because it's more than a passion, an obsession. And then the final criterion here is atypical sensory reactivity. This can be sensory processing issues, hyper or hyposensitivity to certain stimuli, etc. Right, following the rigid definition of autism, i.e. going off of actual DSM-5 criteria, Ranpo exhibits the following in my opinion. Difficulty with communication and connection or understanding social cues and norms, which is under emotional reciprocity and general socio-emotional and communication issues, persistent preoccupation with objects, which is stimming or extreme attachment to objects, and that specifically is his glasses. Then there is also the lack of social emotional reciprocity that I keep mentioning, which for Wampo, it is his general, I suppose, what people say is self-centered because he is self-centered, but it's not necessarily his autism that makes him self-centered, but he does have low empathy. He is very low empathy. And then he does also exhibit sensory aversions and certain sensory issues, mostly in relation to the types of food that he will eat. It's not uncommon for autistic people to have very restrictive food habits or a sort of small palate, I suppose. And with Ranpo, this is his struggle to eat bland food. He explicitly says in the series that he doesn't like things that don't have flavor. He prefers sweet things, which is very obvious from how much sweet and junk food he eats. A lot of people may gravitate towards a more bland palate because it has a more constant experience with food than more flavored things, but Ranpo, I think, is more attracted to flavorful and especially sweet things because he is seeking that sensory experience, but also he doesn't like the lack of sensory experience. This one is more an observation rather than explicitly stated in the series, but it is mentioned in specific Bungo Stray Dogs Tales of the Lost Card, or the BSD game. He struggles to wear form-fitting clothes. His general everyday wear is a lot baggier than other clothes we see him in. I have the specific BS Tales of the Lost card here. I have to read it. All dressed up for the banquet, he complained about the banquet relentlessly, but was quite satisfied after stuffing his face with a variety of delicious finger foods. And in the dialogue that is paired with the card, Ranpo complains about his attire, which is formal wear, which is, tight, compared to his everyday wear, where he doesn't wear his tie correctly. He arguably wears his vest oddly. The best way I can describe it is it appears like he tucks it in the sides, because of the way that, like, in the front, his button up under his vest is. But more on specific sensory behaviors, we also do see Ranpo stimming, which, like I said, is an essentially repetitive sensory self-soothing behavior. Every person normally seeks sensory stimuli to calm themselves, however, is especially present with autistic individuals and I suppose neurodivergent people in general. We see a lot of scenes where Ranpo is really attracted to like his ramen marbles and like is looking at it, rolling it, and you can see it as just like a one-off. He just really likes marbles, but like I like to think or interpret it as like sensory behavior. And that specifically is an example of tactile or visual stimming, and we do see Ranpo tactile stimming a lot more. There's a few panels where he flaps his arm when really excited. I think one is specifically when him and Po get Fukuzawa again, and Ranpo is excitedly telling Fukuzawa what's like going on, and he's flapping his arm. I'll also reiterate the fact that he does not go for a bland palate. He only really likes flavorful stuff. He will not eat anything that is plain. He refuses to, which is more taste stimming. I don't know the actual term for it. I also want to talk about the specific way that Ranpo communicates and socializes. He communicates in a very, frank manner. He's very straight to the point, blunt, and unintentionally, or maybe intentionally at some points, comes off as rude to the people around him. And there's a few scenes that I want to use that exemplify this. He puts down others for not being as intelligent as him, but I don't really always think it's his intention. when pointing out the obvious to people, and subsequently he is coming off as unintentionally rude. An example of this would be the first introduction we get with Ranpo, Murder on D Street, the scene where he is talking to, I believe it's Minora, and he's with Atsushi and Dazai, and Dazai stepped in front of him, and it's like, oh, Rampo's just always like this. Well, Ranpo, like, looks a little bit confused, but he was just, like, acting like his normal self towards Minora. He is kind of self-aware of the fact that he, comes off this way to people in some ways. And he doesn't always act according to the social expectations of others, and he verbalizes this many times in the series. Along with this, he's very chatty. He goes on about his own findings in such a way that he gives off the impression that he's always looking down on others with a flippant attitude, and that is true, definitely. Ranpo has a huge ego. He has a big pride. He doesn't always intend for that to be the effect. There are also a few times where it seems that he misses social cues or characters' words go over his head. Some of it can be literal thinking, like in his character card, his likes are logical thinking, and this is because he's an intellect. He's an analytical detective, yes, but I also like to think that it's because a lot of autistic people struggle with non-literal thinking. Not all, but a lot do have very literal understanding and thinking. It goes beyond his ability to discern logical facts too, because specifically he's talking about how he communicates with others, how he understands social communication from other people. And in the Untold Origins light novel, he expresses throughout the novel that there's something else that everyone else gets that he doesn't, and that he's isolated from everyone else because there's something that he does not understand with the way that the world works, with the way that people act and speak around him or to him. Going back to the main point on empathy, like I've said, he is very low empathy. It's a pretty common autistic trait, but it's just as probable for an autistic person to be on the extreme opposite. One of his most outwardly defining traits is the attitude he carries for other people. He is self-centered, but it's not the entire story. He struggles to identify with other people's emotions. That's to say that his way of thinking is very literal, like I stated earlier. He struggles to conceptualize other people's emotions, but he expresses compassionate and cognitive empathy, which is the desire to help and the desire to understand people, rather than what people traditionally thinking of empathy is, or emotional empathy and feeling other people's emotions. I had to look this up to read it. It is referring to the capacity to understand other people by ascribing mental states to them. So it is understanding people's beliefs, desires, intentions, emotions, and thoughts may be different from one's own. Ranpo exhibits this most heavily in the Untold Origins light novel, when he is talking about how he thought everyone else was thinking the same way that he was. He thought that everyone could see all of the obvious signs of the cases that he had, anything else, right? Ranpo just kind of lacks an ability to do this, and that's heavily associated with autistic people because lack of social emotional reciprocity. So there is deficits in theory of mind, mostly in autism. However, it's also heavily associated with many other disabilities, disorders, conditions, etc. All right, moving on to my last point about Ranpo and socialization and communication, or what I believe is my last point, as far as his textbook traits go, is his struggles with recognizing boundaries with other people. This is through inability with personal space and his inability to conceptualize with others a lot of the time, which I explained through theory of mind. To give a specific example, I'll use the scene of him and Mushitaro in The Perfect Crime arc. Ranpo is in this segment just trying to be a little bit of an asshole. However, it's not the only time where he just like kind of, I suppose, disregards boundaries, because he doesn't see a problem with what he is doing, and he doesn't act conventionally according to the expectations of others. And like a lot of the time he misses social cues. It's an example of that. And it's usually if it isn't a priority his mind, or if it goes over his head that he's an inconvenience to people. He probably should have put his preoccupation with objects section along with his stimming and repetitive behaviors or restrictive behaviors, but it's fine. But what I'm talking about when I'm talking about his comfort objects or a specific object that he is very preoccupied with, it is his dependency on the glasses that Fukuzawa gave him. Comfort objects are something common with autistic people, as the emotional attachment to an item could be related to security or other factors of soothing of sorts. He gets extremely upset when he's without his glasses, so far to go as he has an entire meltdown in the Poe Murder Mansion chapter. He wants them and gets upset when he doesn't have them because they are need to activate his ability or ultraduction, but they also serve as an important reminder of Fukuzawa, who Ranpo values greatly in his life, probably the most important person to Ranpo. They are just a cheap pair of glasses, and I find it likely that Ranpo recognizes this, but he values it because of its connection to his father figure, as well as his intense attachment to his ability, which I will explain later. I want to go on about that specific scene in another segment related to his meltdowns. That explanation will be later. Continuing on with his specific textbook autism traits, though, is aversion to change, and he really refuses to go outside of his comfort zone. There's really a point where he goes out of his way to differ from his regular. He's very insistent on the fact that he's a detective despite being aware of the reality. He doesn't want that to change. It's part in due to the attachment to the ideal and his ability to let go of the image he has resulting from his self-expectations and expectations from others. It also connects to how he's so attached to the idea because it was the first way he was able to make sense of the world. And he lashes out towards Yoshino in that scene that I was referring to, where he has a meltdown in Poe's murder mansion due to her potentially challenging this idea. Okay, moving on to my last point about why he's like very textbook autism coded is his restrictive and unconventional interests. I wouldn't so much say that his interest in his detective work is a special interest or a restrictive interest in that kind of category, but it can read as such if, again, you're reading him with autism. And not every autistic person has a narrow focus of interest, niche, or ultimately odd interests are highly associated with autistic people, though. Ranpo fits into it very well, in my opinion, as evidence of how he works. He has a tendency to reject anything outside of his scope of interest. He refuses to handle cases that he is not interested in, and he only really handles the most gruesome cases, I suppose I'll say, for the agency and when he is needed specially for a case, of course. His interest falls under an umbrella of the grotesque and weird, and he only uses his full brain power on the main thing that matters to him, his detective work. While this is because of his position as the heart of the agency, it's also heavily with Ranpo can't really apply himself to the same level on other things outside of this bubble, similar to how a lot of autistic people have restricted interest expertise. It takes a lot of energy. Before I move on to other general what I read as autistic traits in Ranpo, I want to discuss how he fits the autistic savant stereotype. And if you are not familiar with what a savant or savant syndrome is, it is special skills and intellectual abilities with individuals who have otherwise restricted abilities in other areas. So someone may have intellectual and cognitive deficits, however, they excel in artistic, mathematical, scientific areas. Other examples of this would be Sean Murphy from The Good Doctor. If you read Spencer Reid from Criminal Minds as autistic, I do. He's also a savant. The guy from The Rain Man, I'm gonna be honest, I forget his name. And while there is a portion of autistic people who are are savants who fit the savant designation, it's a lot lower than people would think. And the savant stereotype is vastly overrepresented in really all media, I would say, but especially fictional media. And it's kind of a way that I feel like people autistic characters, but also don't say they're autistic. So think Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. He's very autistic. He's a savant, but I think, as far as I'm aware, the creators like didn't want to label him that way. And like I don't know if he was actually the butt of the joke all the time, but it like definitely seemed that way. And Ranpo does fit the stereotype because he's an analytical detective. He's super intellectual. He's the smartest guy in the series. That's like one of his defining traits. And he generally has social and communication difficulties, which is pretty typical of the savant stereotype, or specifically the Asperger's idea of autism, which is an out-of-date diagnosis. It has a lot of controversial history with it. I would love to explain why, but I don't exactly want to get into all that because it's a whole other conversation. And that's why it's a spectrum. But if you are to label Ranpo with any like specific, I suppose he would be labeled as high functioning autistic, which is usually what like savants are. And I don't really like functioning labels for, again, a lot of reasons, but that's another topic. While Ranpo does fit this stereotype almost to a T, I think he's still probably one of the better executions of this trope, simply because of how he is treated by the characters, by the narrative, and really written as a character himself. Because Untold Origins, and really the rest of the series, but especially the novel, goes into his own struggles and like why he is the way he is, but also rarely do any of the actual important people in his life, i.e. the ADA, Fukuzawa, his parents before they died, there's a fundamental difference between him and others that is very much established. And I'll go into detail more about this when I go into Untold Origins, specifically through a disability or autistic lens. However, that's one of the things that I like the most about Ranpo when you read him as autistic coded, because he's never labeled as like negative for his autistic traits from his loved ones. 3, 2, 1. I want to go over the scenes of Ranpo's autistic meltdowns next. Autistic meltdowns are defined as intense, uncontrollable responses to emotional and sensory triggers. They're caused by a central nervous system overload in autistic people, and they're really the most, I guess, dramatic state of autism and its traits, because a lot of people consider them to be tantrums. However, they are not that, because they're involuntary reactions to being so overwhelmed. With Ranpo, he has 2 specific meltdown scenes that I want to cover. The first one you can kind of read as not being a meltdown, but kind of just him being upset by change and not having his comfort object. I've already mentioned Ranpo's extreme attachment to the pair of glasses that Fukuzawa gave him in the Untold Origins light novel. And in the Ranpo and Po chapter 32, I don't really remember what episode it was of the anime, Po trapped Yosuno and Ranpo in his novel through the use of his own ability, and they go into a subspace world where abilities do not exist. Yosuno has a real ability, that being her healing ability. Ranpo does not have an actual ability. Instead, he kind of acts like he does and encourages the idea that he does. Upon entering the novel and coming to that realization that he does not have his glasses, because as far as Po is aware, Ranpo does have a real ability at this point, so he does not have those glasses, as Po knows that activates ultra deduction, or Ranpo's ability. He immediately shows extreme distress because he does not have the object that he relies on the most for regulation, and he starts to lash out at Yosuno in particular, and I really like how she handles it specifically, and I'm going to play the collection of scenes of what I am talking about.
Roll, aren't you, Ranpo?
I'm not!
Why don't you use your ability already?
I've lost my glasses.
Hmm?
They were a special pair that the boss gave me. I need them in order to activate my gift. But what difference does it make? Didn't you just mention that your healing ability wasn't working on the guy? Well, then my powers of ultra deduction probably wouldn't work in this place either.
So that's how it's going to be, isn't it? Try to piece together what happened.
Get real! That sounds so lame and boring! I don't want to do all that tedious work! That stuff's for suckers, not master detectives like me!
You must have drawn some kind of hypothesis.
I can't do any of that if I'm not able to use my special ultra deduction ability. I need to have the glasses the boss gave me! Or are you trying to say that he lied to me about all of that?
Of course not. You're absolutely right, Ranpo.
After Fukuzawa, Yoshino is the one who has known Ranpo the longest in the Armed Detective Agency, so naturally she is more used to how he is and knows how to handle him the best. And that is by not lashing out back, or it is not by negating him, it is just continuing to support him and try to de-escalate the situation. After this, Yoshino tries to go and do it on her own because she knows that Ranpo is too distressed to function right now. In the end, Ranpo does end up solving the mystery and they get out of the novel, of course, but I really like this particular scene with the two because one, it shows their relationship and how at least Yoshino supports Ranpo, and there are many scenes of Ranpo doing the same and supporting Yoshino back, so I really like how it characterizes their relationship, but also how Ranpo is viewed by those around him in relation to his visible autistic traits. From here on out, I'm mostly going to be talking about the Untold Origins light novel and everything to do with Ranpo's character and his autistic coding. So there's going to be a lot of spoilers with that, even though most of this video has not been very spoiler heavy. The second meltdown that I want to talk about is in the Untold Origins light novel, and is one of the most pivotal moments for his character in the Untold Origins novel. His meltdown is in the theater, which resulted from his ongoing frustration and isolation from the world around him. And this is a large part of many autistic experiences because of the isolation and not understanding people. Ranpo specifically has a meltdown because he doesn't understand what other people are thinking. He does not understand the world around him. Ranpo lost his only support through the form of his parents because he was a very sheltered child, lived in a village with his parents, and he had no other family and was only from a small area. So when his parents did die, and it's an unknown amount of time how long that was before the Untold Origins light novel. However, it was enough to where he bounced from place to place and got kicked out a lot because of how he was. Not so much of how he behaved in general, but when he would say things that they did not like or reveal things that they did not like, he would be kicked out. So it makes sense that this culmination of Ranpo's isolation and struggles, it makes sense that he breaks down like this. And it is really the final precursor to Fukuzawa fully stepping in to guide Ranpo because he begins to understand how truly desperate and isolated Ranpo is. It wasn't as well adapted in the anime, in my opinion, because it takes out the meltdown part because Ranpo is loud. He is yelling. He is screaming. He is crying out for help. So I'm going to be playing the stage play adaptation instead because I really like how Ranpo's stage actor does it.
イライラする。
そのくらいにしろ。
なんでなんでみんなこんな劇見るの。すごくイライラするよ。僕にはもう何もわかんない。誰のこともわかんない。ねえ、どうして大人はこうなの。ねえ、どうして世間はこうなの。誰も説明してくれない。
その叫びは刹那的に考え出されたものではない。長い間胸の中に降り積もった疑問と鬱屈が呼び水となってほとばしっている。
みんなが何考えてるかわかんない。怖いよ。怪物に囲まれてるみたいだ。誰も僕のことを分かってくれない。分かってくれる父上と母上は死んでしまった。異能者がいるなら助けてよ。天使がいるなら助けてよ。なんで僕は一人なんだ。 なんでこんな怪物の国で一人で生きていかなきゃいけないんだよ。
やめろ。教えてやる。お前の納得のいく答えを話してやる。だからやめろ。
I want to start off by saying that the proper response to a meltdown is not to grab or restrain someone. That can be very dangerous. However, I don't necessarily blame Fukuzawa for his fast reaction here, because this is the first time that he has been met with this kind of reaction from someone, especially because it is an autistic meltdown from Ranpo. This specific scene really gets to me because of how Ranpo is characterized throughout the novel and how he is differentiated from the world around him and how he is isolated from it. Moving on from the context of only his meltdown in the novel, I want to talk about Untold Origins more as a whole, especially in how Ranpo gets his ability and how it relates to autistic masking and trauma in the novel. Now, the most obvious trauma here is the death of Ranpo's parents. It takes a toll on anyone, however, it's especially important to consider the fact that they were Ranpo's only source of support, and he has been left with no one else in the world until he meets and Suguzawa and Fukuzawa steps in. In part, I feel like that is the reason that Ranpo gets so attached to Fukuzawa, because he was the first positive adult role model in his life apart from his parents, and was really the only one to try to make an effort to understand Ranpo in this light novel. Now, I want to specifically talk about his ability, and I want to talk specifically about his ultra deduction ability for a minute. Ranpo is the only character based on an author who does not have a literal ability, and I believe his lack of ability but insistence on keeping the illusion up is reminiscent of autistic masking. Masking is camouflaging autistic traits in order to appeal to neurotypical or holistic, that is, non-autistic, behavior in order to fit in, or an array of examples of forcing yourself out of your nature. Long-term masking can lead to extreme damage to one's mental health. It can cause autistic burnout. It can cause distress behavior like meltdowns and shutdowns. It can cause issues with your sense of self and identity, among other things. Ranpo does not mask much in the present canon. He has a support system with his friends and family in the ADA where he is not judged for his traits or behavior. Yet he keeps up the illusion of being an ability user partially for his own sake, but mostly to appear a certain way for the agency and others. His ability is the only mask he keeps up, and the reason for this is the same reason he got it in the first place. Ranpo had to deal with the world outside of himself not accepting him for the way he is, and this is specifically because of his autistic traits. His false ability was essentially given to him by Fukuzawa as a way to quell his frustrations with the world, an explanation to Ranpo for why he is the way he is, because the world didn't understand the way he was, and vice versa. He does seem to mask his autistic traits in Untold Origins, however, both due to his experience he talks about and his parents. Relating to his parents specifically, I do have a quote here for this. Ranpo says, my father always said, one day you're going to surpass your mother and me, and you're going to win the admiration of all those around you. But now that's not the time. Stay humble and keep your silence. Always be modest. Just quietly observe and don't hurt others with what you discover. Or something like that. I don't really know what he meant though. I take this to be an example of Ranpo's parents encouraging him to mask, because as far as I understand in reading the light novel, they never discourage him for his autistic traits. In fact, before Fukuzawa, they are the only ones who do understand him. And it appears they were very aware of the way he was and the differences between the way his brain and other people's works. And that is why they tried to kind of protect him by sheltering them, but to protect him by sheltering him. And while it came from a place of love, it ultimately does have a negative effect on Ranpo, because he does not get the socialization that would be needed through interacting with peers his own age or really anyone else. It's undetermined how much exact interaction he got with people outside of his parents, but from how it appears, it was very limited until they died. Masking itself can be very traumatic. Growing up in a world that is not built for you is traumatic, and the culmination of it all is what leads to Ranpo's meltdown. Being autistic isn't inherently traumatic, however, the instability of day-to-day life can be correlated with it, and it's the case for Ranpo. He goes about the story assuming that he will get adverse reactions if he speaks up or acting like himself, showing his specifically autistic traits, and this is the reason that he masks. Like any other autistic person, he masks in order to survive situations or to avoid confrontation over it when he never intended it. He was already a sheltered kid, and so he was raised with the deliberate suppression of his autistic traits to everyone except his parents. He can't control, and his traits cannot be separated from him. Even if it was an effort to protect him by his parents, it has negative consequences, like I said. Growing up that sheltered is damaging enough, but it is dire to understand that this is in relationship to Ranpo's being autistic as well, because he was thrust into a world that already did not understand him as a young autistic person after he lost his parents and added trauma on top of the loss. The manifestation of his ability is not a literal one, unlike the other characters in the series, but it is an extension of his need to mask at times. Whether it is damaging or not, Ranpo clings to it because it is both connected to Fukuzawa, and it is the first time he got an answer to why he is this way instead of being told to hide it for the convenience of others. When you grow up in a world that does not like you for what you are, it would only be natural for him to be desperate for the comfort of something after believing for so long that there was something inherently wrong with him. I do have 2 more quotes from Untold Origins to wrap up this section, and this one is, in a sense, that was him being immature. For him, growing up itself would be realizing that he is different from other people, realizing that even while looking at the same thing, he perceives something vastly different from what others do. No, even as a full-grown adult, he would still fail to notice. He thought that other people were just like him, and under that impression, his world was nothing but constant friction between him and everyone else. Nobody had the right to blame little Ranpo for falling into that trap. While the entire novel is about Ranpo being autistic and his struggles with that, I think this quote specifically characterizes it very well, because it is talking about what I referred to as the double empathy problem earlier, and also just his struggle with surviving in a world that he does not understand and he was not taught to survive in because his parents died early. Overall, I think that, like I said earlier, if you do not read Ranpo as autistic, especially in this light novel, that you are missing a big part of his character and his story overall. Because when you view him through that lens and view Untold Origins through the lens of an autistic boy trying to survive in a world that wasn't made for him, and he also was not taught to survive in because the only support he had in his life was ripped away from him. At this point, you were probably wondering, why does it matter in the first place? I have reiterated the point that I believe that if you are not reading Ranpo through the lens of him being autistic, you're missing a fundamental part of his character. However, I can understand why some people choose not to read him as autistic, mostly for the fact that a lot of people think it's disrespectful to the real-life author, or that it's disrespectful to actually autistic people to assign a diagnosis to a fictional character. However, considering the fact that a good number of the people who say and identify Ranpo as autistic are autistic people who do just that, identify with him. Given how much subtext there is to read Ranpo as autistic, I almost entirely believe that it is intentional. However, like I have said, I can understand why people wouldn't think he is necessarily autistic coded, only because there may be the chance that Asagiri did not intend for it to be that way, because there's no way to tell if that was actually present in the real life Edogawa Ranpo's works, or if the real guy was autistic himself. So it is kind of understandable to why people would not want to read fictional Ranpo that way. That being said, he is entirely disabled. He is neurodivergent. Specifically, he is autistic. And I feel, again, as when people choose to deny that he is autistic but still affirm that he is neurodivergent, you're just being purposefully ignorant. He is specifically autistic and has specifically autistic traits to his character, to his story. Me personally, I have related to him for a long while. I specifically relate to his feelings of isolation, his feelings of misunderstanding, some of his specific autistic traits that I have identified here, and that is why he is one of my favorite characters. Overall, I do believe that he is a fantastic character, written amazingly, and I am, in fact, blazing Ranpo. I do not care. I love him for a reason, and it goes beyond just me being able to identify with him as an autistic guy myself. In conclusion, Ranpo is autistic, and it very much does matter in Bungo Stray Dogs because a lot of the characters are disabled, visibly or invisibly. And denying Ranpo would be denying the fact that mental health in general is a huge theme in BSD. You cannot go into the series, in my opinion, without acknowledging that, and acknowledging the fact that Ranpo is disabled. If you made it this far into the video and you've actually watched the entire thing, I really just want to thank you. I have posted multiple times about Ranpo's autistic coding on multiple of my social medias. However, I've never actually put it all into one gigantic thing like I sat down and did here. Bungo Stray Dogs is something very personal to me because it's my own special interest as an autistic person, and identifying with Ranpo really sets in my love for the series even more. I hope that anyone who did watch this either identifies with Ranpo or can appreciate the idea that BSD is inclusive for more than just PTSD and other mental health conditions, but also that it focuses on disability as a major theme. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.